Are you just getting started with raising quail, or maybe you're looking to get started with raising quail? Today's video, we're going to discuss all the basics, everything you need to know to get started on the right foot. Hey there, welcome back to another Slightly Rednecked video. Again, my name is Chris. If you're not familiar with this channel, I help you to produce your own meat, eggs, and vegetables from your backyard, your balcony, your deck, your garage, or even a spare room in your house if that's the way you want to do it. Like I said, we're going to be talking about the basics of raising quail, getting started with raising quail today. And the quail I'm talking about are Coturnix quail. Got a whole hutch here behind me full of Coturnix quail. We'll show them off here in just a few minutes. But while we're getting into it, if you're just getting started with raising quail, you're looking at getting started with raising quail, the very first thing you need to decide is how you're going to house them. Now, quail are the bottom of the food chain. So pretty much every predator out there, dogs, cats, snakes, raccoons, skunks, possums, everything is going to want to eat your quail. You need to give them some kind of secure housing. Whether that means an outdoor hutch like this, a large aviary style hutch, or stacking cages in a garage, or something like that, whatever it is, you need to make sure it's secure and safe from predators. Now, because I keep my birds outside, I do not use rollout cages you may have seen before. And a rollout cage would be a cage that has a slight tilt to it. It has an opening at the bottom for the eggs to roll out so you can collect them without having to get into the hutch to do it. I don't use those because that would allow a space for a snake, a rat, anything to be able to get inside the hutch and be able to eat the birds. I've never had a problem with any predators. I've had raccoons, I've had snakes, I've had all kinds of things come up to the hutch, but never had a problem with one of them getting in or getting to the birds. What I use to cover the hutch to make sure that they have plenty of ventilation, plenty of fresh air, get a nice breeze in the heat of summer. Like today, it's 100 degrees out here, literally 100 degrees before the heat index. And you can see they're doing fine in here. Maybe you can't see that, but we'll show you. What I use is a 1/2 inch hardware cloth. It's a good sturdy gauge. Raccoons can't break through it very easily. There's no gaps in it. There's a couple of gaps up here I need to staple back down. But there's nothing, no snakes are being able to get into it. Nothing can reach through it. It works very, very well. Plus, it allows all their droppings to fall right through, so it makes cleanup a breeze. And that's probably the second point I want to bring up about these birds, is that they are incredibly messy. They produce an enormous amount of waste. So if you want to keep them in a garage or a shed or something like that in a stacking cage system, which is a very common way to do it, just get some kind of dropping tray. You can fashion those out of, I've got some laying over here I was going to show you, but really you can fashion those out of anything. To buy specific dropping cages can get kind of expensive, so you can look for like oil pans from a hardware store. You can build your own out of wood and line them with something, but you're going to have to empty those pretty regularly, so be prepared for that. That's one more reason I like to raise them outside. I allow the droppings to just fall to the ground, clean them up a couple of times a year, and that's it. I don't have to worry about a daily or a weekly routine on emptying dropping pans. But you can definitely raise them inside a garage or inside a shed. I've done it before, and it works out very, very well. You get a little bit more climate control. So if you live in an area like me where it's hot in the summer, cold in the wintertime, you don't have to deal with freezing water in the winter. You don't have to deal with soaring temperatures in the summertime. That's a third point I want to bring up about these birds. They're incredibly hardy. They can handle the wintertime cold. They can handle the heat of summer as long as you prepare them for it and you build their hutch in a way or put them in a place where they're going to be protected from the weather. So I have half of my hutch all closed in. This is a section that's completely closed in. There's a sand bottom on the box. We'll open it up and show you here in a minute. This gives them a place to get into, to hide, to feel more secure. It gives them a place to get out of the weather when the wind's blowing real hard or when it's super cold outside. But they handle all of those temperature swings incredibly well. The other thing I would say is put it under a shade tree. If you get hot summers like we do, like I said, it's literally 100 degrees Fahrenheit out today before the heat index. I had my temperature gauge out here a little bit earlier, and I was my remote temperature, I was measuring the temperature on the ground. It's 125 degrees on the ground in the sun. I've got mine under a big shade tree here, so this provides shade. It's 85 degrees inside the hutch. The surface of the hutch floor, 85 degrees. The walls of the hutch, 85 degrees. That's cooler than the air temperature outside. So if you can keep them under a shade tree, give them plenty of shade in the summertime, they're going to do just fine. You put them out in the blazing sun where the direct sun's hitting them, and they're going to struggle. They're going to have a hard time with that. All right, so let's talk about another thing that you need to consider about your quail. Feed and water, two things right there. You need to make sure you give them fresh, access to fresh water all the time, and you need to make sure that they have access to food all the time. They will not overeat, but if they run out of food, they start to panic. They start to get maybe a little bit aggressive. They'll start picking on each other. You need to make sure that they have food all the time. So how do you go about watering and how do you go about feeding? There's a lot of ways that you can do that. A lot of different kinds of feeders and waterers out there. What I use is poultry watering cups. They look like, let's see, I've got one up here. Somewhere there's one. They look like this right here. Let me clean some of the stuff out of it. This is an old one I had sitting on top of it. They look like this right here. And you can hook these up multiple ways. I screw them into a PVC T that sits on the back of the cage, which we'll see here in just a few minutes. And it's fed by a 5-gallon bucket. You can probably see just on the side right here that I fill with water. A couple of hoses that go to both of my hutches. And that keeps them watered at least a week. I have to fill that up maybe once a week, but that does a good job. What I like about these cups is they do not hold water in them all the time. The birds will peck at that little yellow stopper in there, and that'll let out just a little bit of water that they'll drink, and basically they stay dry, so they stay cleaner. I've used other types of waters, the type you screw onto the bottom of a mason jar. And those get really, really filthy. They hold water in them all the time. The birds tend to relieve themselves right there in the water. They get really nasty. I do not like standing water around my hutches. I don't like the water nipples that you see a lot of times for chickens. Those tend to leak and drip all the time, so it goes through your water a little faster, and it also creates a puddle on the ground, which draws in insects, all kinds of things, which I do not like to have around. So these, in my opinion, are the best way to go, but you can do it a lot of different ways. One thing I will say is when you're talking about baby quail, when your quail first hatch, if you're going to be incubating, by the way, I have a whole series on incubating quail. I'll leave a link up here. You can get to that. If you're looking at incubating quail, it walks you through the entire process. I'm not really going to cover that in detail here because I've already addressed it in another video series. And it's not a terribly difficult process, but it is kind of detailed. There are some things you need to know about it. So if you're looking at getting some information on that, like I said, I'll leave a link up here. Actually, I think it comes up on this side of the screen, but you'll see that. You can get to it. When you're watering the baby quail, they're tiny. When they first come out of the egg, about the size of a golf ball, ping pong ball, something like that. Tiny, tiny little birds. So this is the water I use. It screws onto the bottom of a mason jar. This one's kind of dirty right now, but this is a very small opening. Do not get the ones with the large opening. There's a chicken waterers and quail waterers, and these I think they may even call these quail waterers or chicken waterers as well, but these are very small opening for the water to get through, the space between the jar and the lip of this. And you want to use something very narrow like that, because when baby quail for some reason love to get in the water, if you have an open dish of water, they'll get in it and they'll get wet and they'll get soaking wet, and then they chill, and then they often die. You have a hard time keeping them alive if they get wet and get chilled. But that's for the baby quail. Up until they're about 2 weeks old, this is what I use. And once they're 2 weeks old, 3 weeks old, feathered out completely, I move them into the outside hutches, and they just adapt to these water cups incredibly well, very, very easily. What you may have to do if you've got new birds that have never used these before, just push your finger in there, fill it up with water. They'll go to drink from it, and they'll figure it out. Whenever they hit that tab, it releases water, and they'll get more water out of it. All right, so I think I covered the food and the water. Or no, the water. I didn't cover the food yet. So what do you feed your quail? All my birds, I feed a game bird starter. I get it from a feed store. It's listed as game bird starter, and it's about a 30% protein game bird starter. Let me show you kind of what that looks like. It's a crumble feed. So got a whole bunch of it right here. I don't know if you can see that in my hands. Hopefully you can see that. That's it. It just looks like a chicken feed or a quail feed or turkey feed, any of that kind of stuff. Sometimes that stuff's hard to find. Get this closed back up. Sometimes it's hard to find a game bird starter. Turkey starter is almost the exact same thing. If you can't find either one of those, they will do okay on chicken feed. Get a crumble like that for chickens, and they'll do okay on that as well. What you want to look for in food for your birds are two numbers, really: the calcium and the protein levels. Everything else is going to be pretty similar. If it's a poultry feed, it's going to work. It's going to be just fine. The protein levels, when they're first hatched up until they're about 6 weeks old, let me say they mature in 8 weeks. They're fully grown by 8 weeks old. They grow really, really fast. So when they're young, they do need a little bit higher protein because of that fast growth rate. So you want to get something that's a 25, 20% or higher protein. I like to go up to 30%. My personal preference, I like to stay above 25%. But if you can only get 20%, that's going to be okay. It'll work for them. As they get older, you can switch to another food with a lower protein level, down to about 16% protein if you need to. But I don't. I feed all my birds game bird starter. It's a 30% game bird starter. They do just fine. But if you want to switch them over to that feed when they're about 6 weeks old or so, then you can definitely do that. Switch them to a lower protein feed. It may be cheaper, it may be easier for you to get a hold of, and that will work just fine for them. The other level is calcium. They need about 1.5 to 2% calcium in their diet. As long as your feed has a 1.5 to 2% calcium, you don't need to worry about providing them with any additional calcium. If you do need to provide them with additional calcium, you can do that in the form of crushed egg shells, of crushed oyster shell, any of those things, but do it in a separate container. Don't mix it in with their feed, because too much calcium can kind of be bad for them too. Chances are you're not going to have to worry about that. Most of the feed out there contains at least 1.5 to 2% calcium, so you should be fine. No matter what kind of bird feed, poultry feed that you find, the calcium level is probably going to be just fine for them. If you get too high on calcium levels, it can lead to bone problems. It can also lead to problems with hatching because their eggshells get too thick. The birds have a hard time, the chicks have a hard time pipping that shell, getting out of the shell and hatching out. So that's kind of the food and the water requirements. Let's talk about the feeder real quick. They do make feeders like this, a little bit wider, that screw onto a mason jar. You can definitely use something like that. You can use a feeder like this right here, which is more common of a chicken feeder. It's got a lot of holes in here. You just fill it up with feed and the birds eat out of there. Now this is, I don't really use either one of those for my birds. When the birds are young, when they first hatch out and they're in the brooder box, then I just throw the feed on the floor, because in the brooder box they're on a solid floor. I'll show you what I use. This is my brooder box right here. It's just a great big Sterilite container. I've cut part of the lid off, replaced it with wire so there's ventilation in there. I'll put a heat lamp over the top of it to keep them about 100 degrees roughly until they feather out, which is about 2 weeks old. I cover the bottom with paper towels. That's what I use for bedding when they're young. You can use wood chips, you can use sand, you can use some of those things like that. I don't personally like to use that. I like paper towels. It's easier cleanup for me. I just throw the feed straight on the floor. I don't even put it in a container, because quail are incredibly messy eaters. So if you put food in something like this right here, now when they're in the brooder box, that's not a big deal because it's a solid bottom. But in here, they're going to throw a lot of feed out of this. You're going to waste a lot of feed. It's going to fall right through the cage floor onto the ground. So I avoid these kinds of feeders. I'll show you what I use right now is a Tupperware style container. However big, it doesn't have to be this big. This one's actually very large. I use smaller ones usually, but that's it. And just cut a couple of holes in it, about an inch around. You can get a hole saw and do it very precise. I'm looking behind me to make sure I don't have any birds come to the front or jump out. You can be very precise, about 2-3 inches up from the bottom of the container, and then you just put the food up to just below the holes. And this really reduces your waste. Got an egg in here too. So that's the eggs that you can get out of the birds. We'll talk a little bit more about those here in just a few minutes. Okay, so that's the basic feed and water requirements. Like I said, the container doesn't have to be this big, as big as what I've shown, but I do highly suggest you use something like that that's going to reduce your waste. You can look up, there's all kinds of different designs. That's the simplest. I just fill it up with feed, throw it in the bottom of the cage, and that feed will last these birds. I've got, I don't know, roughly 20 birds in this hutch right here, and that'll last them probably 3 or 4 days. If I don't, if I need to not check on them for 3 or 4 days, they've got food, they've got water easily. So that takes care of that. All right, let's talk about with your housing, how many birds can you expect to fit in your housing? If you've got an outdoor or a hutch like this that has a wire bottom where the waste can fall through, you're looking at about 1 bird per square foot is a good general rule. You can pack them a little bit more densely than that if you need to. I tend to not go quite that dense, but you can get away with 1 bird per square foot. So this is a 6 foot by 3 foot hutch, so it's 18 square feet. I guess I do have it a little bit more packed more densely than that. I've got about 20 birds in here probably right now, but you know, you can get up to about 25 birds in there if you needed to. It's really, and you can tell I've got birds in here. When we go to look at these birds, you'll see they're not overly crowded. It sounds like a lot, but it's really not that dense. They tend to hang out in groups anyway. That's just the nature of the birds. All right, what else do we need to talk about by housing? You will hear some things that talk about your housing height. You don't want it too high because the birds spook and they'll fly up, and they do that. But they don't get them much of the concern is that if you make the cage too high, that they will get too much momentum when they flush, and they'll hit the heads on the top and break their necks and die. That's pretty rare if it ever happens. I wouldn't really be concerned about that too much. But with that being said, you don't need to build your cages too high anyway. Quail are ground-dwelling birds. They don't roost, so all that extra space is just wasted space. Make it comfortable for you to be able to reach in and get inside. That's all you need to worry about. I tend to build mine about, I think this is 24 inches high, because that's the size the hardware cloth comes in, 24 inches. So it makes it really easy when it goes to wrapping the cage with the cloth, the hardware cloth. All right, so that's some basics about, you know, the quail care in general. They're really pretty easy birds to take care of. There's not a whole lot that you have to worry about. A couple things I will tell you about these birds. You should expect them to start laying eggs around 8 weeks old, and they'll continue to lay about an egg a day as long as they have enough light. Light is the #1 factor that with whether they're going to lay eggs or not lay eggs. They need 14 hours a day of consistent light, and it doesn't, not direct sunlight, just light. If you keep them in a garage and you have lights on a timer that lights up above their cage, that's going to do just fine. They'll go ahead and lay, and they'll lay all year long if you keep 14 hours a day of light on them on a regular basis. If you keep them outside in a more natural environment where the days get longer in the summer and shorter in the winter, around here, I'm in southwest Missouri, usually naturally they start laying eggs somewhere around March, and they'll lay all the way through about late October, and then they start shutting down because the days gets too short at that point to keep them laying. So that's the #1 thing that will keep them laying or not laying is the amount of light. The other thing, that birds don't like to be moved around a lot. If they get stressed out, they'll stop laying eggs. So moving them around from one cage to another will get them to stop laying eggs. If you buy quail from somebody and you're bringing them home and they laid an egg in the cage while you're bringing them home, maybe laid another egg the next day and then they stopped, it's just stress. It's because of the move. Those eggs were already in their cycle, going through their egg laying cycle when you bought them, and they stopped, they shut down because of the stress of the move, and they'll pick back up in about 2 weeks, as long as you can keep them fairly stress-free. If you have a lot of predators pressuring them or anything like that, that can address it as well. But really the biggest things are if you move them around a lot. So if I were to take these birds out of this hutch and move them to the other hutch, they'd probably stop laying eggs for about 2 weeks. It's just normal. You don't want to move them around a lot. You want to give them a fairly stable home. So we've talked about a couple of things, the housing, the space requirements. Let me address this in another way as far as space goes. If you want to build an outside aviary where you keep them on the ground in a more natural environment, there's a good chance that they will go broody in that situation. They do not when you keep them in a hutch. You have to have an incubator and incubate their eggs, because it's incredibly rare for them to go broody when they're living in a hutch like this. But it isn't uncommon when you've got them in a large aviary ground style cage where they have access to the ground in a more natural environment. The thing you're going to have to consider there is, like I said, these birds produce an incredible amount of waste. So you're not going to be able to, first of all, get as many birds in a small space, because you're just going to have too much waste buildup. And second of all, you're going to need to know a way to deal with that waste. So that's a topic for a whole nother video that we can get into a lot more discussion on. But that is an option. You can raise them in that kind of an environment if you want to. You're just not going to be able to pack them as densely. You're going to need a lot more space for the same amount of birds. And again, you're going to need to be able to deal with the waste. So let's get in and let's look at how my hutch is set up. And you can kind of get a couple of ideas of what I'm talking about with giving them shelter, giving them a place to move around, get plenty of ventilation. I think I kind of capture all that stuff in this hutch. One thing I will say is I put a roof on my hutches. This keeps the rain off of them a little bit. But I also raised it up quite a bit, and people want to know, why did I put a big space there? It's so I can set things on top of the hutch. So when I'm in here and I get their feeder out, I can set it on top of the hutch if I want to. And it's just convenience for me, really, is all it is. So let's take a look at these birds. Let's see what quail look like. These are Coturnix quail. I've got a little bit of a mix. Most of these are considered jumbo pharaoh. but I do have a couple of other colors in here. Quail come in, the Coturnix quail come in a variety of different colors and different styles. They're all going to have pretty much the same characteristics. If you're looking for just meat and egg production, Jumbo Pharaoh is probably your best bet. They're by far the easiest, the most productive, the biggest. They get the biggest of all the quail. They're not incredibly big birds, but the Jumbo Pharaoh get the biggest, or as big as any other jumbo quail does. And they lay pretty good size eggs, very productive with their egg laying. I mean, that's pretty standard across all the quail. Anyway, you can look into different varieties, and if you want all the different colors and things like that, everything else still holds true for them. But I do raise primarily Jumbo Pharaoh. So let's take a look at the hutch and see how I've got it built. All right, so this is my outdoor open area. It's got a wire top on it. It's got wire on all the sides, wire on the floor. Let me open it up a little bit, and there you go. You can see the birds inside there. One thing you might see too, this bird that just crawled in there, kind of raggedy looking, has a lot of feathers missing on its back. It's because he's molting right now, so it's pretty common. So this is my feeder, just sits in here. You can see the water in the back. The birds just peck in the water to let water out and get a drink whenever they want to drink. And you can see I've got a white bird in here. It's a Coturnix quail. They'll crossbreed. You don't have to, I mean, it's no different than any other birds. It's just a different color. So this is all open, gives them plenty of ventilation. Their feeder's out here, their water is out here. The other side where they tend to spend most of their time is a sandbox. Let's move over there. So this is the other side of the hutch, and this is a sandbox that's closed in. I've got a clear plastic over the top so it lets light through, but it does protect them from wind, it protects them from rain, all those kinds of things. This is where the birds tend to spend most of their time. Most of the birds like to kind of hang out in here. And I've got another egg in here. Oh, stay back, guys, stay back. Whoa, I lost a bird. Okay, leave it. Good boy. Out, off. Okay, caught him. I don't know that I can open that side with one hand. I'm gonna open this side. There you go. All right, let's open this back up so we can see what's going on. Usually, if I stand in front of the hutch here, I don't have problems with them jumping and flying out. But you can see this is a sandbox. As far as what kind of sand to use, I mean, you don't have to have a sandbox. It is pretty nice. Stay back, buddy. There's a rooster crowing. It is pretty nice to have because the birds really enjoy it. They get in here and they dust bath in it. They like to kind of hang out here. They lay most of their eggs in here. And the nice thing about them laying most of their eggs in here is you get eggs that are just really clean. No droppings on them or anything. Just really clean eggs. So that's pretty nice. Let's see, what else about this? Anyway, you can see this is just closed off. Gives them protection from the bottom, protection from the top, and all the sides are solid. I do have to clean this out occasionally. I just use I've got a window screen here. I use like this. I just scoop up the sand and sift out the droppings. And that's it, just sift out the droppings. I'd probably do that once every, I don't know, month and a half or something like that. It's really not that bad. All right, so a couple things we need to talk about. We've talked about your ratio, how many birds you could fit in your space, but you also need to consider how many roosters you have versus how many hens you have. If all you want is egg production, you don't plan on incubating eggs and producing meat birds, you don't need any roosters. The hens will produce eggs even without a rooster present. But if you want to be able to incubate eggs, you are going to need roosters to make sure you have fertile eggs. You need one rooster for every 4 to 5 hens. Don't go over that. If you have too many roosters, they're going to beat your poor hens up, and they'll pull out all the feathers on the back of their head. When they breed, they grab the feathers on the back of the hens' heads. If you have too many, you're going to end up with birds that get pretty beat up. It can be pretty bad. So you really don't want to go over one rooster for every 4 to 5 hens. That's plenty to make sure that you have fertile eggs. Another problem you may run into aggression is when it comes to trying to combine birds from different flocks in an existing hutch. So if I were to buy some birds from somebody else, full-grown adult birds, and bring them and throw them into this hutch, chances are they're going to get the tar beat out of them, and they could even get killed. These birds get fairly territorial, so they will fight off any kind of new birds, sexually mature birds that come in. Now, with that being said, I've had really good luck moving birds that are 2 to 3 weeks old from the brooder box right into here. They tend to mingle with the flock just fine, no problems whatsoever. But sexually mature birds, that's a different story. If you need to do that, if you need to combine two groups of older birds together, try to do that in a neutral environment, an environment, like move all of the birds to a brand new hutch together, and that should reduce a lot of your issues with the aggression and the fighting, the territorial displays. Let me wipe some sweat out of my eyes because it is warm out here today. All right, what else do we need to talk about with these birds? Those are the basics. They're pretty easy birds to handle. Really not a whole lot that you need to worry about. If you can just follow those guidelines, keep them safe from predators, give them enough light to make sure they lay eggs, keep them fed and watered, you're going to get great results out of them. If you want to start incubating eggs, like I said, check out that playlist I have on incubating eggs. That'll walk you through the entire process. But other than that, that's pretty much the basics. There's not really a whole lot to these birds. They're pretty easy, very prolific. You get an egg a day out of these birds. You can save up those eggs for about 7 days before you have to set them to incubate. So if you figure if you've got 10 birds in here that are laying an egg a day each, 10 hens, and then that would give you 2, maybe 3 roosters at the most. So 12 to 13 birds, 10 hens, laying 10 eggs a day for 7 days, that's 70 eggs. If you get a 50% hatch rate, that's 35 birds that you're gonna get to hatch out. And then you can raise those up, and in 8 weeks, they're ready to process, they're fully grown. That's 35 birds you could be putting in your freezer and feeding your family. And you could do that all year long if you want to. I primarily focus on it mostly in the spring and the summer, but you could definitely do it in the fall and the winter time as well. They're incredibly prolific, a great way to add a meat source to your family. And also, I will mention, I live in town, so I can get by with this where I couldn't get by with raising chickens for meat. Because I can't have a chicken rooster in town. I can have these birds, nobody even notices. My neighbors think they're just songbirds. I mean, they know I have quail now, but for the longest time they didn't. They just thought they were songbirds. They don't even notice. So it's a great thing to do if you live in town as well. Anyway, hopefully you enjoyed this video. You got the information you were looking for out of it. If there's questions or comments, leave them down below. I haven't been very good at answering comments here lately, so I may not respond directly to that. But I do see those comments and questions come up, and I tend to address that in future videos. Also, I have live broadcasts Thursday nights, 7 o'clock Central Time. Come there and we will get your, I respond to everybody during the live broadcast, so we can get questions answered during that time frame too. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed it. As always, God bless.